Okay, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get the webinar started. Welcome. I'm Molly Robb, the project coordinator for the California Evidence-Base Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, or CEBC for short. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to the webinar. We've muted your phones due to the high number of participants attending, so if you're experiencing any technical difficulties or have any urgent questions, please use the Q&A pod located at the bottom right corner of the screen and we will do our best to assist you. We will also answer questions after the completion of the webinar. Please also find PDFs of the webinar PowerPoint slides and other webinar relevant materials in the bottom left corner of the screen in front of you. Lastly, you will receive an email with a link shortly after the conclusion of this webinar to complete a short and easy survey so we can continue to improve our webinars and make them as useful and beneficial as possible in the future. And now for a brief introduction of our presenters. Dr. Mark Courtney is a professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago and an affiliated scholar at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Dr. Courtney is a national expert on child welfare issues and policies. His fields of special interest are child welfare policy and services, the connection between child welfare services and other institutions serving marginalized populations, and the professionalization of social work. His current work includes studies of the adult functioning former foster children, experimental evaluation of independent living services for foster youth, and the influences of juvenile courts on the operation of the child welfare system. Jared Martin is a research associate with the Chadwick Center for Children and Families at Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego. Jared's primary role is to support the CEBC's work on promoting guidance and resources on the implementation of evidence-based practices, which includes conducting trainings and webinars on the implementation topics, providing technical assistance, and synthesizing the latest implementation research for the CEBC website. And so without further ado, I will now turn it over to Dr. Courtney. On over to you.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to try to do today is provide an introduction, kind of an overview of both why it's important to have evidence for programs supporting foster youth's transitions to adulthood, and then also kind of what the state of the evidence is up to this point.
Okay, so Dr. Courtney has a poll question, and we're going to go ahead and facilitate that. So the first poll question is, what service sector most closely aligns with your work? And so you can see the responses up on your screen, and then you should see a box with the actual poll question response. So we're getting some answers coming in. We'll wait till they kind of slow down before we close the poll. All right, just a couple more seconds. And all right, so we'll go ahead and end it there. It looks like the majority of you are from child welfare agencies, followed by community-based agencies. And then after that, looks like mental health is the third leading group of folks on the webinar. Great. So we'll go ahead and close that one. And then we have one more follow-up poll question, and these are really just focused to help us get a sense of who's in the room with us. And so this question is for those of you working in an agency that provides services to youth, what is your position type? And so you can see the responses there, and we should have another box open up on your screen where you can give your response. And we'll just give this a couple seconds. All right, so we'll end it there. So it looks like the majority of you are in direct service, followed by the next group of you, largest group of you is administration or leadership, and then followed by a combination of some sort of dual role in your agency. All right, great. Well, thank you, everyone, and so I will pass it back over to Dr. Courtney.
Okay. Thanks. That's great to know, actually. I hope this information is useful to folks. It should be, and might have some great questions at the end. So before getting into the situation for foster youth and the policy context and everything, just some background about the transition to adulthood generally is important, because I think we need to think about that when we think about services for any populations, what's going on generally for that population. And as I suspect folks on the webinar are aware, the transition to adulthood in the U.S. Has become more lengthy and less sort of linear than it was, say, in the post-World War II era. A lot of the markers of the transition, living on your own, being financially independent, starting a family, finishing your education, are happening several years later in the life course. Half of young people between 18 and 24 in this country are living with one or both of their parents, and they get a lot of direct support from their parents. Developmental psychologist Jeff Arnett notably has come up with this term emerging adulthood to describe this period of young adulthood as a period of experimenting with various life roles. And then lastly, neuroscientists have pointed out that the human brain continues to develop into early adulthood in areas of brain functioning that are very important for decision making. And so I think there's a recognition that this is a period of time that requires a lot of support, which I think is reflected in the fact that a lot of young people continue to rely on their family. And yet, U.S. policy, with some notable exceptions, I think the change to the Affordable Care Act that extends health insurance to allows parents to keep children on their health insurance into adulthood up to age 26 is a notable exception. I think there's a recognition by policymakers that this is a challenging period, but U.S. policy for the most part doesn't really provide a lot of support for young adults. Notable exception to that, though, is in fact the population of youth in foster care. And you can actually go all the way back to 1986, and we had the Independent Living Initiative, Independent Living Law that provided services to help foster youth make the transition to adulthood. In fact, this policy reflected more recently in the Foster Care Independence Act of 1999 and the Chafee Foster Care Independence Program. At least up until very recently, the goal of this policy was the idea that we would somehow empower young people in foster care with the skills they needed to be able to make it on their own once they reach age of 18, because the policy context was that, with only a very few exceptions, if you were in foster care in the vast majority of states in this country, you were in fact rendered independent at the age of 18. And so there was a recognition that on the one hand that was a tough row to hoe, but that was the policy context. So what can we do to empower young people to make it on their own? The 1999 law doubled the funding that had been around for a number of years to $140 million, expanded the age eligibility down to 14 to give child welfare agencies longer to help prepare these young people, allowed states to use up to 30% of their money for housing and other concrete supports, gave states some flexibility to use Medicaid at their option for young people up to age 21. And it created a couple of accountability provisions that are important context for my presentation today. One, the National Youth and Transition Database, which tracks data on a sample of young people in each state through age 21. But more directly relevant to what we're talking about today, federal funding for program evaluation in this area. And this is actually language from the Foster Care Independence Act. It says that as part of this, the 1.5% of that $140 million has been set aside each year for rigorous evaluation of programs of potential national significance, with a strong emphasis for rigorous evaluation designs, including random assignment evaluation. So that's the broad policy context generally for independent living programs. And then, of course, even more recently, very important development policy is the Fostering Connections to Success Act of 2008. The youth provisions of that law allow states to extend foster care to age 21 for young people in care on their 18th birthday, and it has some eligibility requirements that reflect, I think, developmentally appropriate tasks during this period. They, in order to remain in care, young people need to be going to school, working in a job training program, or incapable of doing one of those things, one or more of those things due to a medical condition. Importantly, the law continues all of the other things I've already talked about, including the Chafee provision. So this is important, I think, to the folks looking for evidence-based interventions, because we now need to look at evidence-based interventions not just for minors who are in care to prepare them for independence, but also for young adults who are actually remaining in care into adulthood, or may have left care, but we're still wanting to help them even though they've reached the age of majority. So briefly, in addition to this big policy context that suggests, wow, we're spending lots of money on programs intended to help foster youth successfully transition to adulthood, we should evaluate that. The outcomes, what we know about outcomes for former foster youth during early adulthood, I think, are sobering and call for attention. So we know that outcomes are relatively poor across a variety of domains. So I'll just summarize some of this. The trends are generally problematic with respect to education, although some young people remain in school. You see a decline in education after the age of 18, that when lots of young people are going off to college, and that's certainly something that's very important these days in terms of the labor market. Some increase, but generally relatively poor engagement in the workforce. Earnings are low, employment rates are relatively low for this population. Many of these young people have non-resident children. In other words, they have children at higher rates than their age peers, and more of those children are not living with these young people. They're living elsewhere, including, in some cases, in the child welfare system. Troubling levels of justice system involvement continuing through the mid-20s. And where we have data functioning in other domains, behavioral health, risk behaviors, victimization of these young people by others is also troubling. We generally see that males fare worse in most of these dimensions than females. But despite that sort of average picture, it's important to recognize that many of these young people leaving care are doing quite well. They're avoiding a lot of the outcomes that any parent would want their young adult child to avoid. And there's a huge heterogeneity in the needs of these young people. I'll just throw one example out. We know pretty stable data on the educational aspirations of these young people. About 3/4 of them, want to and expect to graduate from college. If you ask them that at 17, if you ask them that at 19, you find that out. So that means, we ought to be able to support those efforts. On the other hand, about 1/4 of them don't want to do that. And I think if we're going to respect that variety, we need to be open to a range of interventions, for example, around how we're helping them acquire skills they need to be economically self-sufficient. Some of them, it may be training or getting them a job, and that's really what they want. They don't want to continue school. The other thing we know, we have reasonably strong evidence of, is that policy matters. There's evidence that remaining in care, if you compare outcomes between young people who are allowed to remain in care in a state like Illinois, for example, to other states that aren't, you find that they do better in a lot of these outcomes, education, employment, et cetera. We're not that clear about why that's the case, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the policy context at the state level. So we now have another poll question.
Yes, we do. So the question is, what is your level of familiarity with evidence-based practices? And so you could see the responses there. A, very familiar. B, somewhat familiar. And C, not familiar. And we'll give you guys a couple seconds. Go ahead and close the poll. It looks like the majority of you have some familiarity with evidence-based practices. You've attended a training or have done some work involving EBPs, followed by very familiar, which is about 22% of you. Great, thank you so much. Dr. Courtney, back to you.
Okay. So what do we know? Well, about 10 years ago, Paul Montgomery and some colleagues of his at Oxford did a systematic review through something called the Cochrane collaboration on evaluation evidence up to that point in time of independent living programs. And basically they concluded there just weren't any rigorous evaluations to date. And furthermore, when they looked at the kinds of programs that were out there, they said, we really need further evaluation research, and we need to do experimental evaluations as both feasible and necessary. And I'll come back to that as I talk about some of the work that's been done since then. The most important well, certainly the largest program of work on trying to evaluate the evidence of independent living programs came through something called the multi-site, let me see if I have that little table, multi-site evaluation of foster youth programs, which is something sponsored by the Administration for Children and Families in the federal government and the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. And that is an ongoing series of evaluation tasks. And full disclosure, I was involved in that set of evaluations and remain involved in the team that is taking that forward. And the evaluation questions starting back in, I believe, 2001 for the first set of random assignment evaluations done in this country in this area were what's the impact of identified programs that we're able to identify, I'll come back to that in a minute, on youth short and long-term functioning? What are the features of the identified programs that are likely to influence their impact on youth clients? And to what extent might these programs be adapted to other locales? And I should be clear that this program of work was the work funded under that Chafee Act, the provision that I showed a bit ago that charged the head of the Department of Health and Human Services with identifying and rigorously evaluating independent living programs. So that's what this is doing, is carrying out that mandate. So what we did when we got into this was trying to find basically programs of potential national significance to evaluate. And one of the challenges of that, and this I think is a challenge for even thinking about what we mean by evidence-based programs in this area, is programs for foster youth or so-called independent living programs, it covers a huge terrain, really. You've got hundreds of programs, and they differ with respect to both the outcomes they're trying to achieve, the characteristics of populations served, and the overall size and scope of the program. And then they also vary quite a bit with respect to the kinds of services they provide. So I think most commonly the notion of life skills training, some programs do that pretty much exclusively. Others include that in what they're doing. Some of them have mentoring components. Some of them provide housing. Some of them focus more specifically on health and behavioral health. And some of them may focus more specifically on human capital accumulation, education, and employment. So it's a huge field. It isn't looking for evidence-based intervention around intervening with trauma, for example. As broad as that field is, it's nowhere near as broad as this conceivably is. So we have another poll question.
Okay, so this isn't a question where you're going to be using a poll box. You're just going to be using the chat box. So using the chat box feature, if you are a agency that provides services to transition age youth, do you serve any subpopulations? So for example, parenting youth, youth with mental health needs or developmental disabilities, or any other characteristics. So if you could take a minute to just type in what are some of your subpopulations. So it looks like developmental disabilities, youth with developmental disabilities, someone with runaway homeless youth, all of the above, youth with behavioral needs, probation involvement, a couple folks who are parenting youth are their target population, lots of mental health, few people with runaway homeless youth programs, human trafficking, substance abuse, immigration, substance abuse again. Okay, great. I think this gives us a picture of the broad populations that are served by everyone on the line. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks. And I think that does indicate but breadth of the population, and also, some of these young people clearly have, while, all young people have common needs, some of them have particular needs, and I think that speaks to the breadth of program development in this area. So in what we call the Chafee program of work, or the multi-site evaluation, we sought a variety of programs. And what we needed to focus on was foster youth likely to be in care until emancipation, because we're supposed to be helping to transition to adulthood. Because of the language of the legislation, we needed to look at programs that are innovative, of national significance, and capable, in principle, of being expanded into other areas. Programs that would agree that random assignment was possible. This set of evaluations, that was a requirement for participation. We didn't consider any other evaluation designs, and it had sufficient sample size that we thought we would be able to determine, whether there were differences between the outcomes for a group that received a program or intervention and ones that didn't. The other things we took into account when we were looking for these programs is the stability of the program. Something that was very new or rapidly changing was tough to choose for evaluation. Intensity of services, programs that had well-defined theories of intervention. I'll come back to that as a challenge. Those that were consistently implemented across the program and over time. Those that had some existing data, so we could get a sense of what populations they were serving and what benchmark outcomes they were achieving. And then again, not just willingness to implement random assignment, but also if we needed to alter referral procedures or other logistical issues that were needed to do random assignment, we looked into that. So before I get to the actual programs we evaluated and what the outcomes were, I would say that the main takeaways from that first set of evaluations had to do more with the state of the field of independent living services than they did with the 4 programs that I'll briefly discuss today. So we went all over the country. We went to conferences of folks that provide these programs. We did 28 separate site visits. We consulted with all the independent living coordinators at the state level. And what we basically found after all that is that many promising programs are very small, and very few of these interventions had been taken to any kind of scale that really indicated how practical it was to implement them on a larger scale. Many programs, I think, I don't think I'm going too far as to say most programs had poorly developed or really non-existent logic models. So if we sort of sat down and asked the question, lay out for us what the logic model or theory of change of your program is, why do you target the population you target, what are the, what outcomes you're trying to achieve, and what's the theory in your mind between the inputs in your program and those outcomes, most of these programs really couldn't do that. Many of the programs also had an insufficient understanding of the broader service context in which they operated and how that context could affect their likely impact. So, for example, lots of foster parents and group home agencies actually are engaged in working with young people to help them acquire life skills. And that's a very important context. If you're trying to operate a program focused specifically on life skills training, you need to be able to up the game, so to speak, over and above what's happening already. And I think a lot of the folks developing these programs really didn't have much of a sense of what young people were getting generally. We evaluated a tutoring program. Turned out that 60% of the young people in the control group were going to get tutoring anyway. I mean, the context of foster youth during the period of study was that many of them were, in schools that were not doing well, and under No Child Left Behind, they were eligible for tutoring already. So, but it turned out the program managers for the interventions the Child Welfare Agency was funding were largely unaware of that. And then we also found that many programs had relatively weak dosages, and they just weren't likely to be able to move the dial on the outcomes they were trying to impact. So, but the good news, I think, in terms of the multi-site evaluation is that we found out that rigorous evaluation really is possible. We did random assignment in 4 sites. It does give you unbiased estimates when you execute it properly of the impact of programs. A lot of folks were skeptical that you'd be able to follow foster youth over time, and we were able to do that with 80% and more, 90% in some cases of the young people in these evaluations, even in control groups that were not getting services provided through the evaluation. And we also were able to, in some cases, take advantage of administrative data that were reasonably, cheap. For example, data on college enrollment and attendance to enhance the analysis, both the service provision, we had service data, but also program impacts. So what were the programs we evaluated? We evaluated 4 different programs, 2 of them in Los Angeles, 1 in Kern County, and 1 in Massachusetts. So we evaluated a classroom-based life skills training program called LST in Los Angeles County. We evaluated a tutoring mentoring program called Early Start to Emancipation Planning, E-STEP tutoring in Los Angeles. We evaluated a program in Kern County, California that was an employment services program that really basically took the county's TANF program and took some staff from the TANF program and offered that kind of service with the idea that a lot of these young people will be working in service industries, reasonably low skilled, similar to TANF applicants. Basically what we found in those 3 programs, we're not going to spend really much time on them at all, is that none of them had any impact on the targeted outcomes that they were trying to have an impact on. However, there was a program called the Massachusetts Adolescent Outreach Program, and it did have some impacts, and I'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about that program and one other evaluation today in some depth because I think there's some common themes that are worth noting. So the evaluation design for all of these evaluations, including the Massachusetts program that I'll talk about a bit, was a rigorous design, random assignment. Young people were assigned to the intervention or to a control group that received services as usual. We talked to young people 3 points in time in baseline, right when they were assigned to one of these 2 conditions, and then twice over the ensuing 2 years, once at 1-year follow-up, once at 2-year follow-up. In some cases, we used administrative data like data on college enrollment from the National Student Clearinghouse. We also did in-depth implementation or process studies with 2 rounds of visits to all the sites, again, including adolescent outreach. So the adolescent outreach program in Massachusetts is operated by the state agency. It's a statewide program. It's essentially a intensive case management model. I'll talk a little bit more about that, providing individualized services to transition-age youth over and above, distinct from standard once a month visit of an ongoing services caseworker. It provided some direct assistance and referrals to other services. So the eligible population was young people who were 16 or older and had a permanency goal of independent living. So these were young people who were expected to age out. And that was the program overall. And what we ended up evaluating was the extension of that program for a special population. I think this is important to keep in mind. At that point, the state was not providing this service to children or young people in therapeutic foster care. And so they expanded the target population to serve young people in therapeutic foster care in the state of Massachusetts. And then referrals of youth in therapeutic foster care can be made by their public agency worker or initiated by an adolescent outreach program worker. And they prioritize young people who are nearing the age of 18. In other words, we're getting ready to sort of step off that cliff, if you like, but also young people who are pregnant, parenting, or homeless. So young people were randomly assigned either to get that additional help or not to get that additional help in Massachusetts. So what did the program look like? These outreach workers met with youth weekly. That was sort of the standard. And sometimes it'd be, more than that, but generally that was the standard. On average, the young people were served 22 months on average. 16 months of active service, what they would call that, once a month, and then six months of tracking. And they also were supposed to create a service plan based on the youth goals, refer youth to service providers, and engage in activities with youth and demonstrate life skills. I'm seeing in the notes here that some people aren't seeing the slides. Molly, can you let me know if that's true? Looks like other people are having. So somebody's having a problem, but evidently most people aren't, so I'll continue. So that's the program. They also, and this is, I think, a very important part of the context there. So they assisted these young people in filling out applications and financial aid forms and otherwise pursuing their education, getting education training vouchers, etc. And they also encouraged young people to sign a voluntary agreement to remain in care past 18. So in Massachusetts at that point in time, you could remain in foster care. It was a state-funded program. This was before the Fostering Connections Act extension provisions. You could remain in foster care after 18 if you went to college, basically if you were going to school. And so these things kind of went hand in hand, right? If you're encouraging young people to stay in care, you also need to encourage them to go to school. But they also, as part of their program, would help them access financial supports. They would provide some mentoring, and then they would try to provide other kinds of assistance, or help them get a job, housing, refer them for physical and mental health services. So let's cut to the chase here. So we did find some positive impacts of this program. Some of them, are interesting, but potentially less important. So young people in the treatment group, for example, were more likely to have some official documents. So for example, 60% of the outreach group, program group, had a driver's license at follow-up compared to 37% of the control group. It's also the case that they were more likely to have continued contact with a public agency. Now, that's the way we ask the question. We view that as a proxy, basically, for young people remaining in care. And remember, they can remain in care after the age of 18 if they're going to school. So you can see the difference there, 65% of young people in the program group versus 47% in the control group. The most interesting and I think important finding with respect to impact was a significant difference in college enrollments and persistence between the control group and the outreach group. So you see under attended there, you see two statistics, 56% and 60%. So the first refers to self-report of the young people, but then remember I mentioned that we were able to link our records to National Student Clearinghouse data from community colleges and four-year colleges as well. And so that's why you see those two statistics. But in both cases, there's almost a 20% difference between the percentage of young people going to college in the treatment group versus the control group, with the treatment group having better outcomes. Persistence means they went to school for more than one semester, and we got that from the National Student Clearinghouse data. You can see as well that there's a positive impact on persistence associated with this adolescent outreach program. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, and this comes back to something I said earlier in what we learned about Chafee, is the policy context is very important to understanding the impacts of these programs. And quite often we try to develop programs and develop an evidence base for programs, and we're really rather agnostic or ignorant about the policy context. In this case, Massachusetts allows young people to remain in care if they are going to school. And so we needed to look at, well, how much of the impact of this program is through, it's hard to tease it out, but we tried to tease out how much of the impact of this program on college enrollment is the program itself versus the program getting young people to stay in care, because remaining in care gives you housing, food to eat, etc. And so we basically concluded that the staying in care actually accounted for the lion's share of the variation between the treatment and control group in college-related outcomes, whereas the outreach involvement per se accounted for much less of that. And so the main takeaway here is if you're going to implement this kind of program, in a state that did not allow young people to remain in care past 18, you really have to be skeptical of seeing these kinds of impacts. I mean, we don't believe you can use these evaluation findings to assert that providing this kind of program in a state that discharges young people routinely at 18, that you would see the same kind of impacts. So a couple of comments on this evaluation, and I'll come back to the other program I'm going to talk about as well. So I think it's important to see the impacts of this program in the context of an individualized program. So what kind of program is this? This is not a program that targeted parents around parenting or young people who are going to college and we want to keep them in college. This targets all young people who happen to be in therapeutic foster care, and it is driven by the engagement between this adolescent outreach worker and the young person. So in other words, one young person may say, I want to go to school, help me with that. I want to get a job, help me with that. I want to manage my relationship with my boyfriend, or I'm having a hard time with my mental health needs. So it is by design intended to cover a variety of impact domains. And some of these young people don't need help, arguably, in particular domains. So in that context, the narrow range of impacts and education is somewhat surprising. And in fact, that was a frustration on the part of the people operating the programs. They really thought, well, gee, we think we have an impact on education, but also employment and mental health and risk behaviors, et cetera. And we didn't see those impacts. This is a program that's supposed to have general impacts, and really what we saw is primarily in education. The other thing in terms of generalizability, and this is again something we should always think about when we look at the evidence of a program and we're thinking about trying it in a new place, is, do we think this will work with the population or in the area that we're trying to implement it? This is a study population of youth in therapeutic foster care. So these are young people with, generally more behavioral mental health needs, maybe not quite as much as you would see for young people in group care. So interesting question, how might it work for other populations? What might it look in states with a different policy context, for example, with respect to extended foster care? And then lastly, a really important question around any program that adds a caseworker, right? It has a caseworker, so social worker, if you want to call it that, but it doesn't really matter what their degree is. If you're adding a helping professional and the mechanism of change is time between this helping professional and an individual, you need to think about, okay, how many other helping professionals are working with that individual? How many other caseworkers does this person have in their life? How does this fit with existing case management? In Massachusetts, this was an additional caseworker over the standard caseworker that these young people had. So I will conclude with a much more recent evaluation, and one of a program that had impacts across a broader range of outcomes, and that's the YV LifeSet evaluation. So YV LifeSet is actually called the Transitional Living Program operated by Youth Villages that's headquartered in Tennessee. What I'm going to do is provide an overview of the evaluation quickly and then its impacts. So what we did in the evaluation, and I worked in the evaluation with the evaluation firm MDRC and Youth Villages. And what MDRC did was implement an implementation study and an impact study. I'm going to talk about the impact study. But the implementation study provided a lot of detail about what services were provided, how they were delivered, and what challenges were encountered. And you can find that report on the MDRC website. The impact study essentially asks the question, what are the effects of this transitional living program, now called YV LifeSet, on young people's outcomes in key domains? And do those effects differ depending on characteristics of youth? I'll come back to that. So the research design, similar to the last evaluation I told you about, was a random assignment design. Eligible youth were assigned at random into two groups. The program group was offered transitional living program services. The control group was not offered those services, but provided with a list of resources available in the community. We enrolled 1,322 young people in the study, with more in the control group than or more in the program group than the control group, but that was a random process. The intent was to enroll more in the program group than the control group, but that was done randomly. And data were collected on both groups for 1 year after random assignment. Before I talk about the data source, let me talk about who these young people are. So in Tennessee, they operate a unified juvenile court, and so the same court that handles child welfare or child protection cases handles juvenile justice placements. And what essentially the state of Tennessee did is it wants to provide transition services to young people aging out of both the juvenile justice and child welfare system. And so this population that we were studying was young people who had aged out or were aging out of both those systems. And the data we collected was at the time of study enrollment at random assignment. We collected implementation data from interviews with staff and participants, observations, staff surveys, also had data from the management information system of Youth Villages. But what I'm going to share with you today is outcome data at a 12-month survey we did. And also we have data from, the National Student Clearinghouse on college enrollment. So what did the impact analysis look like? We looked at impacts 1 year after random assignment, and we assessed differences in service receipt. And we measured impacts in key outcome domains. And these are outcome domains that the Youth Villages staff running the Transitional Living Program believe their program should have an impact on. So education, employment, housing stability and economic hardship, social support, health and safety, and criminal behavior. So it's a very broad range of outcomes that they wanted to have impacts on, and they believed that their program should have impacts on this program. So those were measured in our follow-up survey. And so here's the good news. There's actually a fair amount of good news. So we found at 1 year that there were a number of significant positive impacts of the program, and I summarized them briefly here. Again, there's a much more detailed report available on the MDRC website. So the program, involvement in the program increased earnings by 17%, or $611 per year. It doesn't sound like a lot, but again, that's 17% of what increase over what the control group was earning. Reduced housing instability. We had a number of measures of housing instability, a whole scale on housing instability, but the one I would emphasize here is a 22% decrease in homelessness, self-reported homelessness of these young people.
Get out of there.
Could somebody mute their line? There's somebody else talking there. It reduced economic hardship, 22% decrease in, for example, a 22% decrease in delaying the payment of a bill in order to buy food, but there were other measures involved in our scale of economic hardship as well. It did improve some health and safety outcomes. We had a measure of depression, anxiety, and stress called the DAS-21, and it reduced, those symptoms across those areas of depression, anxiety, and stress in a statistically significant way. And it also reduced the likelihood of being in a violent relationship. We asked young people whether they're in a relationship and the nature of that relationship. The more disappointing news for Youth Villages, and I think they're invested in trying to understand why this was the case and improve their program, is there were no significant impacts in some areas. So, for example, there was no impact in educational attainment. Interestingly enough, that was the one area that the other case management model had an impact on. No impact in social support, criminal behaviors, or contact with the criminal justice system, and very little evidence of differences in impact by youth characteristics. What I mean by that is we looked at some subgroups. So we looked at whether young people had been exclusively in juvenile justice custody versus child welfare custody. We looked at urban versus rural differences. We looked at whether young people had been able to take advantage of an extended foster care program in Tennessee. And we really didn't find any differences in subgroups. So we believe these impacts, the positive impacts and the lack of impacts, really apply generally across this population. I realize I didn't provide much detail about this program. It too is essentially an intensive case management program, but it's more intensive than the Massachusetts model. So the young people would work with a caseworker, but that's called a TL, or transitional living specialist. But that specialist has a caseload of no more than 8 young people, whereas in the Massachusetts Adolescent Outreach Program, the caseload would be twice that. And that caseworker also gets a lot more training and supervision, including training in evidence-based interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy in the Tennessee program than in the Massachusetts program. So they're both intensive case management programs. One is more intensive and more infused, if you like, with evidence-based training for the workers. So how do I interpret the impacts of this program? Again, I think impacts need to be seen in the context of an individualized program. So you have services provided by design to cover a variety of domains. So we shouldn't be surprised that the outcomes are not concentrated in one area. And in this case, we don't see that they're concentrated in one area. We see them across a number of domains. And so modest impacts across multiple domains, which is what we're seeing here, is not necessarily surprising. And the other thing I should say is the impact on housing and economic well-being is noteworthy. And the reason for that is this is not a housing program. They don't provide housing. The report does provide some data on some, they provide some short-term, financial assistance, but it really amounted to just, a few $100s on average. It really wasn't enough to cause the impacts we saw on reduction of homelessness and economic hardship. So the fact that a case management program can reduce economic hardship and housing without really paying for housing is noteworthy. what populations can we expect the program to help? Now that I think is a bigger question. So this is a voluntary program, and out of every 100 youth initially deemed eligible by youth villages in terms of, being in the care system, etc., only 25 of those young people opted to enter the evaluation. So, some young people opted out perhaps because they didn't think they needed help. Some would have been deemed ineligible because they were just perceived as an active threat in the community or an active threat to themselves. So I think that's an important question to consider when you think about this particular program. What impacts would look like in states, localities with a different policy context? So again, Tennessee has a very idiosyncratic policy around extended foster care. They don't provide extended foster care if young people are working, only if they're in school or have a disability. And again, how will that case management role fit with existing case management arrangements in other jurisdictions? Now, there are a couple of other programs worth mentioning. Both of them have been developed by folks at Portland State. So there's a program called Better Futures, which was subjected to a small random assignment evaluation of young people 16 to 18-year-olds in foster care with significant mental health problems. So it's focused on young people with mental health problems. It involves a 3-night summer institute, some peer coaching and mentoring workshops. And again, in this small evaluation, it showed some impacts on post-secondary education, participation, preparation, and some measures of sort of well-being, hope, self-determination, mental health empowerment. Another program developed by this group of folks at Portland State focused on young people in foster care who had disabilities, specifically were in special education, so they had educational disabilities. They were roughly the same age range, 16 and a half, 17 and a half, and this program provided coaching for youth in the application of self-determination skills, participation in mentoring workshop with foster care alumni. So again, it had sort of workshops and some mentoring coaching. And it demonstrated 1-year impacts on employment and high school completion. So I think these are very interesting and promising programs. There's some evidence behind them through a rigorous evaluation. And they're focused on distinct subpopulations of youth. So if you're thinking of employing those, you want to see whether the population you're working with really looks like who they were serving. So to conclude, what do we know? We know more than we did back in 2006 when there was a big review done and they said we don't know anything. And I would summarize it in a couple of bullets here. One, I think we need to look at the kind of case management we provide to transition age youth. It does look like, significantly more intensive case management targeted at transition age youth instead of just the general child welfare population has promised to improve a range of outcomes for transition age youth. But we need to keep in mind when we do that the impact of that case management may be influenced both by how intensive it is, but also its relationship to the current policy context, particularly with respect to extended foster care. In other words, are young people already going to get housing, food, and one meeting a month with a foster care worker or not? And secondly, there's some evidence from these evaluations of Better Futures in my life that coaching and mentoring interventions have populations, at least for these special populations. Those interventions haven't been implemented at the scale that either of the case management models that I talked about have been implemented. So thank you. I think what we're going to do is hold off questions until after Jared has talked about the clearinghouse's agenda in this area.
Great, thank you, Dr. Courtney. So yeah, we are going to hold off on questions at this point. We did get a few, so we're going to, just because we have only probably about 25 minutes left to get through my section, and so I want to make sure that we have enough time to do that, and then we will allocate some time for questions as well. So yeah, thank you for the great summary of all this work. I know that these are very large-scale studies, and so it was a great job summarizing in very good detail, what you found and what were the lessons learned. So the focus of my presentation is programs that support you transitioning into adulthood that are available on the California Evidence-Base Clearinghouse. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the CEBC, we are a program funded by the Office of Child Abuse Prevention, which is housed within the California Department of Social Services. And we are operated and managed by the Chadwick Center for Children and Families at Rady Children's Hospital. And I think I didn't say my name. So my name is Jared Martin. I'm one of the research associates here. So last poll question, I promise, is how familiar are you with the California Evidence-Base Clearinghouse? So Molly's going to go ahead and open up that poll question. And I'll just give you a couple seconds again. So it looks, the responses are, or the options are A, very, B, moderately, C, slightly, or D, you never heard of us. All right. So it's looking like the majority of you haven't heard of us, and followed by only slightly. All right, so we'll go ahead and end that. So that does give me a sense of kind of what level of detail I should kind of explain what we're all about. So thank you for answering that last poll question. All right, so our mission at the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, as Molly had mentioned, we go by the CEBC, is to advance the effective implementation of evidence-based practices for children and families involved within the child welfare system. So we do that with two main goals. First is we have a program registry where we review and we rate programs with varying levels of supporting research evidence that are, that fall within broad domains related to child welfare. And I'll go ahead and talk about in more depth how we do that, and also how you can access those programs. And then the second piece of our work is focused on implementation, which we just launched about a year and a half ago, a new section to our website, which is all about selection and implementation of programs within child welfare systems. But also, even if you're not a child welfare system, as we saw in the poll question, that there are a lot of folks that aren't, you can still utilize the CEBC as a resource for not just the program registry and looking at what's out there, but also how do you properly select an EBP, and how do you go about implementing one. So this is a screen cap of our homepage at our website. So this is kind of the face of the CEBC, and you can see, it mirrors our mission in that we have a portion of our section that you can access that leads you to the program registry, and then on the right-hand side, there's the selection and implementation work. And so you'll notice that it says happy 10th birthday. So we just turned 10, and we celebrated that by giving the website a little bit of a facelift. The colors are different, the logo's different, and this is the first in many changes that are to come to our website, where we're trying to make it a little bit more user-friendly. We're finding that there's a lot on our website, and even for someone like me who's on it every day, finds that it can still be challenging to find things. So if it's hard for me, I'm sure it's hard for someone who's never been on it before. So hopefully today I'll go ahead and show you a few steps on how to access our program registry. But there are other webinars that you can access that show you how to access different types of content on our website. Okay, so getting started, so I just wanted to kind of briefly touch base on what we view as an evidence-based practice specific to child welfare. So some of you may have seen this image before on the right or the left-hand side of the concentric circles on how EBPs are really the integration of the best research evidence, the best clinical experience, but also they're consistent with family and client values. So many of you are already familiar with EBPs, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. But if you're interested in learning more, we have a dedicated site on our website that's all about understanding evidence-based practices. Where did they come from? Some of the history, how they have evolved and entered into the child welfare sector. But really what I wanted to focus on is that last bullet point on the bottom that says programs have varying levels of supporting research evidence. So one thing that's important to note is the term evidence-based it's kind of being used as a catch-all for many different types of programs that have research evidence. So the programs that Dr. Courtney talked about are programs that have been subjected to experimental design. So the ones that had random assignments, there was a control group. So that level of research is the highest level of research that a program can undergo in order to be found, in order to discover that it is effective or not. So that's just one form of research methodology. There are other forms, and so I wanted to take a moment to talk about our scientific rating scale. So as I mentioned in our program registry, we have programs that with all kinds of research evidence. And so when we rate these programs, we're looking at their published peer-reviewed research to make the determination about how effective they are. And so we use the scale to inform us on how to go about doing that. One of the handouts in the file section on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, I believe it's handout 3. It should say overview of the CEBC scientific rating scale. If you haven't already downloaded that, I encourage you to do that because that's what you're looking at the screen. That's what's on the screen right now in the PowerPoint slide. It might be a little bit hard because it's a very zoomed or it's a very pulled out view of it. So if you want to download that now, and you can actually pull it up and follow along as I talk about it. But I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this because there's a lot to it, and there are other webinars that you can access that go into detail about not just our rating scale, but there are other clearinghouses, what their rating criteria is, how it compares to ours. So you can access that on our website if you're interested in learning about the differences between rating scales on our website, on the SAMHSA's website. They review programs that are related to substance abuse and mental health. And then there's also the Blueprints website as well. And so that's a recorded webinar on our website. But really quickly, what I want to focus on is the top left-hand corner is, the program needs to have a manual or a book or training that's available in order for it to be replicated in other settings. So if you're interested in adopting, the program that Dr. Courtney talked about, like YV LifeSet, you have someone that you can reach out to that has information that can provide training. They can give you a manual that your staff can use to help guide them throughout the implementation of it. Moving over to that, to the right, it says it must meet the requirements to be included in the CEBC topic area. So I'm going to go into more detail about that in the next couple slides. Moving over to the right again is where it says outcomes of research. Research studies must be published in a peer-reviewed journal. So this is a biggie, particularly for this topic area because it's a little unique. There are studies on programs that are rated an NR with an R scale, which means not able to be rated by the scientific rating scale. But we give it that rating because it doesn't have published peer review research. It could have research, and it could have research that shows that it's really effective or promising, but unfortunately our hands are in a way tied because we cannot rate that program because the peer review, we go by the peer reviewed standard. So that's a critical piece of information. I'm going to skip the rest of them, but you can see that where the green boxes, the shades of green, are where practices have been subjected to research methodology. So ones and twos are programs that have been subjected to randomized controlled trials and that have some degree of follow-up. So ones are a 1-year follow-up, twos are at least a 6-month follow-up. Threes, in order to be a 3, a program needs to be, it needs to have some form of a control group. So they can have a pre-post They measure clients before or right at baseline when they enter the program, and then they measure them again, but they need to have some sort of comparison group or control group. 4s and 5s are when you start getting into concerning findings, so whether the program showed no effect or if the effect was concerning, whether it's negative or had some sort of harm. And then, like I had mentioned before, the NRs mean that the program either it doesn't have any research at all, or the program has research, it's just not published in a peer-reviewed journal, or it just doesn't meet the criteria for what I mentioned for the other categories as well. So there are certain levels of nuances to this rating scale, and if you're interested in learning more, like I said, there are webinars, there is explanations on our website. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. But before I do, there's some take-home points that I want to make sure that that I'm being pretty clear on. Programs rated an NR on the CEBC can include research with positive outcomes. So what that would tell me if I was an agency that's looking at adopting a program is, one, to not exclude NRs from my consideration, but to determine if the program has research by using the CEBC to look at the research that's available on it. So each of our program descriptions, or each program that's in our registry, has a lengthy outline that details a great deal of information about the program. And part of that is the research and reference section. So programs that have research that haven't been published in a peer-reviewed study would be listed in the reference section. So make sure you check that out. And another important point is that programs that are rated an NR may actually be a better fit for your agency and your youth than potential programs rated a 1, 2, or 3. The reason why I say potential programs is you see when we get to the topic areas, NRs are pretty much all we got at this point. So just to walk you through our website, to get to the Youth Transition Programs topic area, you're going to click on the View Programs button. And then you can see that takes you to this page. There's a top ribbon where it says Topic Areas. And here are the broader domains that we kind of cluster our topic areas under. We have anger management, domestic violence, behavior management, core child welfare services, engagement and parent partnering programs, mental health programs, prevention and early intervention programs, and then supportive services for youth in the child welfare system. So that's where you'll be able to find youth transition programs. And here you can see within that topic area, we have several, or within that domain, we have several topic areas. Commercial sexual exploitation services, educational interventions for children and adolescents in foster care, mentoring programs, permanency enhancement interventions, teen pregnancy services, and then also finally youth transitioning into adulthood. So when you click on the youth transitioning link, it'll take you to the home page for that. Since there's a lot on it, what I've done is just taken the content and added it to the PowerPoint slide, so it's a little bit cleaner to look at. So here we start out by looking at how do we define youth transition to adulthood programs. So really quickly, these are programs that increase the skills, knowledge, and supports of youth who age out of the child welfare system while in out-of-home care and therefore have to transition out of the foster care system and live on their own. Transition programs are aimed at increasing independent living skills and or developing formal or informal social connections that can provide guidance and support to youth beyond their time in the foster care or receiving services. So the reason why that last piece is bolded is because that is this is an updated definition. We just this particular topic area was actually, I believe, one of the first topic areas that the CEBC launched when it debuted back in 2007. And at that time, there wasn't much out there in terms of programs that, I mean, there are programs out there, but there wasn't much that had undergone research. And so we revisited this topic area within this fiscal year. And what we found is that there are a great deal of programs that address enhancing the social networks of youth with the idea of that once they leave foster care, they have some sort of network to fall back on that can support them, that can provide guidance to them as they enter into adulthood. So the definition continued. So in order to be included into this topic area, programs need to have the target population needs to be youth aging out of the foster care system or who have already aged out or emancipated from it. Services and types that fit assessment, case planning, case management, counseling or mentoring on issues related to emerging adulthood, development of social connections and support systems, education and financial support and or skill building. And then they need to be delivered by child welfare caseworkers, trained paraprofessionals, educators, and mental health professionals. So you notice that this kind of overlaps, well, it does overlap with some of those earlier topic areas that I had called out, like the mentoring programs and also the teen pregnancy programs or teen parenting programs. That's because like Dr. Courtney was mentioning, there is similarities in characteristics when you're transitioning into adulthood that regardless of what your needs are, these are things that need to be addressed. So we are currently looking at including programs from both of those topic areas into this topic area as well. So that's what this is saying. In order to be included, programs must specifically target the needs of youth aging out of the foster care system or the needs of youth with similar characteristics. And so, for example, runaway homeless youth, pregnant or parenting youth, youth with mental health needs or developmental disabilities as they enter adulthood. And then their outcomes need to be let's see, the research evidence that examines outcomes youth transitioning into adulthood, such as independent living, self-sufficiency skills, family social connections, employment, higher education, housing, and parenthood. So these are the existing programs that were already up prior to our re-review of what's out there. So that include ILP Lighthouse, ILP Orangewood, Larkin Street, My First Place, Rising Tides Communities, which is also part of Orangewood, the Scholars Program, and then also the WAY program. And so there are a few updates to these existing programs. So the programs that did some changes since they last posted were Rising Tides, Orangewood, and the TLP Orangewood program. So I'm not going to go into depth about these programs. They've been up for a long time. So if you want to take some of your time later on to check out those programs, but like I mentioned, the only ones that have changed, if you have already seen these programs, are Rising Tides and TLP Orangewood. So what's new? So we've added 6 new youth transition programs with the caveat that there's more to come. And so if you are interested in staying up to date on that, sign up for our email alerts, and you can click on that link and it'll take you to the e-alert page. But in terms of what we're adding, I just want to briefly mention the names. So Dr. Courtney had mentioned My Life and Better Futures. Those are 2 programs that we are currently in the process of reviewing. And then also the Massachusetts Adolescent Outreach Program we're currently in the process of rating. There are 2 other programs that we're looking at, Youth Build, and then also the Transition to Independence process, which commonly goes by the TIP model. So those are programs that you can look out for that should be coming up in the next probably couple weeks, up to a month, but we do send out e-alerts whenever we add new programs. And then, as I had mentioned when I was going over the definitions, that there is similarity with other topic areas. So we're currently crosswalking programs from those related topic areas. The crosswalking hasn't been done yet because when we do that, we need to kind of re-review the research that's out there. It's a very detailed process when we go through this, so that's why it takes some time. But look forward to that and sign up for our e-alerts. I'm not going to go into too much depth about this, but this is when you click on a program. This is most of the programs within our registry include this information. So if you're looking for information about the manual and training information, what are the core components of the program, if it's offered in languages other than English, what are the requirements to run the program, and like I mentioned, the research and the references, and then also if you have questions about a particular program that you want to learn more about, or if you want to kind of start the process to adopt a program, there's contact information for either the program developer or whoever provides technical assistance on that program. So the first program that I want to kind of briefly highlight is Caring Adults Are Everywhere, which goes by CARE. And I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about these programs. You can click on the link to learn more, and I provide the link for all the programs, so when you download the slides, you can just click that, or you can go to the topic area. But CARE is a 12-week natural mentoring intervention, meaning that the mentor is a self-selected, non-parental adult from within the youth's social network. It's designed to address social support needs of youth preparing to exit foster care. The goals include improving youth's non-cognitive abilities, improving youth's pro-social development, improving youth's future outcomes of education, employment, homelessness, use of government benefits, and criminal justice behavior and involvement. Currently, it's rated by the CEBC as an NR, and the child welfare relevance, which I didn't talk about, but that is a scale that we use. It's either low, medium, or high to indicate how relevant is this program to child welfare. And so, for example, programs that use that are meant for child welfare systems or are studied using child welfare populations would get a high. A program that's a medium would be populations with similar characteristics to child welfare, and then low would most likely be programs that just aren't intended for child welfare but could somehow be relevant or useful to them in some situations. So moving on, I want to cover Family Alternatives is a new program we just added, and that addresses the socio-emotional needs of older youth in foster care who are nearing the transition to adulthood. Essential components include relationship building skills, trauma-informed care, and youth empowerment. So the goals include develop agency policies and practices to recognize and support the interdependence of social workers, foster parents, youth, and families, and to empower youth. The second goal is to educate social workers and foster parents on current research in attachment, trauma, grief, and loss, and to facilitate using that knowledge in their interactions with youth. So it's currently rated an NR, but it does have a high relevance to child welfare. MyPath is a savings model designed to integrate into workforce programs. It's rated an NR, and it's medium child welfare relevance. Opportunity Passport is a matched savings program that improves the financial capability of youth ages 14 to 25 who are transitioning from foster care or navigating other youth services. It is a matched savings on a one-to-one basis for purchases that will help youth go to school, get a job, etc. It is rated an NR, but it's a high relevance. The Threshold Mothers Project is comprehensive services to 17 to 20-year-olds. It's a transitional living program, so it's staffed 24 hours a day where mothers and their children can live together and receive support services. I'm going to skip the goals, but you can access more information just because I want to be mindful of the time. And finally, YV LifeSet. And so this is a program that Dr. Courtney talked about, and he explained what it was. It's an intensive case management program. you'll notice that it is rated an NR. And so again, this is, I want to go back to the point that I made earlier that a program, even with experimental research, research that is kind of the highest caliber in terms of identifying the effectiveness of a program, even if it's already gone through that, it can still be receive an NR rating because the research isn't published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I did talk to Dr. Courtney, and he did mention that he, I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning this, but he's working on putting that in a peer-reviewed journal. But the research that he shared showed some positive outcomes. So again, this is just stressing the point that when you're looking at new programs, don't exclude NRs from your consideration because they could have research. So making sure you pick the right program. And so as I mentioned, the CEBC is focusing recently on educating agencies on the selection and implementation of programs. And part of that is making sure you pick the right one. And so when you're kind of sitting down and you're asking, you're looking at, what programs do we want to adopt, we kind of ask that you consider, why are you wanting to adopt a new program? What's the motive? What's driving this? And so is it a funding requirement? If it is, then you want to make sure that whatever the components or the requirements within the funder's kind of scope, what programs that you look at meet that funding requirement. So if it's something like the level of research evidence, or if it has a certain type of component like life skills groups, you want to make sure that the program that you're adopting obviously meets the funder's needs. If you have no available youth transitioning services in your area, so this I'm going to touch on it in a minute, but that would really kind of tell me that you would want to do a needs assessment. What are the biggest areas that we're trying to focus on, or what are we seeing that needs to be addressed? Because there's a great deal of variability in terms of youth transition programs, and you want to make sure that the one that you are selecting actually addresses the issues that you're seeing in your community. And then the current youth transitioning services are not adequate, so that could either mean what you're offering isn't showing to be effective, or it is just so kind of not. There's just limited resources to be able to offer the high amount of youth who are in need. And so that would kind of tell me whether or not you would want to kind of beef up your current practices or your current program, kind of feed more resources into it so that it can start accepting more youth. Or if the program isn't effective, maybe looking at alternatives of what's out there. So as I mentioned, programs are broad, and they feature various requirements and components in different subpopulations. So we always recommend that agencies invest time and resources to critically examining which programs are the best fit. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but we do have several recorded webinars on selection and implementation where we do kind of walk through a step-by-step guide on what are the key considerations, what are the key steps for selecting the right program. One of the resources that we have that we just released is kind of this summarized roadmap of selecting an EBP. And so it kind of feeds you through these steps leading to the selection of a good fit evidence-based practice, but then it also has direct links to some of our technical assistance materials, which you can use within your agency to help drive this process. And so we always recommend that agencies form a team so that they can do this together. It's not just one person, but obviously that can vary depending on the agency and their capacity. But if you have more than one person, and ideally people who have knowledge about the issue that you're trying to address, so transition age youth, that they're at the table, and including the youth themselves, and to help kind of guide this process to make sure that the practice is a good fit. So this is also one of your handouts. I think it's handout 4. You can download it from the Adobe Connect, or you can go download it from our website. So before we wrap up, I wanted to make a point that adopting a new program isn't always needed. When we provide technical assistance to agencies about selecting a new program, we want to make sure that they conduct a needs assessment within their organization to see whether or not whatever the issue is, that it couldn't just be addressed through some minor changes. So that could include changes to internal processes like referrals or screening and assessment processes. As I mentioned earlier, it could also include expanding existing effective programs so that they can meet the needs of the youth, or, and this is a final recommendation, is develop an evidence base for an existing program that seems promising. So in cases where you already have a program that you feel like is pretty solid, you're happy with, one of the things that we recommend is bringing in more of a research base for it. So we just recently released this resource guide on developing an evidence base for your program. So it's not so much a step-by-step guide, but provides information and links to resources that are available to help you develop or create a plan for these tasks. So you can see here it helps with creating logic models, utilizing measurement tools, and then finally conducting program evaluations. So you can download that from our website, and this is also a resource that you can download off of the handouts. Yeah, I think it's handout 5. So I'm going to wrap up here, and so if you want more information, you can subscribe to our email alerts. That's the direct links. Please visit our website, check out the Youth Transitions topic area and our other topic areas. And then if you have any questions, feel free to contact us through our info email. And then we're also on the social media, so if you're on Facebook or Twitter, please follow us or like us. So with that in mind, we're going to open it up to questions for both Dr. Courtney and myself. So this one here. Okay. Okay, it looks like Dr. Courtney, you have a question that's directed regarding the Massachusetts Outreach Program, and it says, wasn't their population much smaller in the California, so they were able to spend a great deal more money than we have here to spend in California?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm not quite sure I understand. I mean, Massachusetts, I don't know offhand what size their foster care population is. The evaluation, off the top of my head, involved a couple of hundred young people. But the program operated statewide, and I think that they just chose to add this resource of the Adolescent Outreach Program to transition age foster youth. So I'm not quite sure why, if they have more money, it's because they chose to raise the taxes and pay it. I mean, the program definitely costs more than standard case management. Standard case management, the federal government requires you, if you're a state or a county, and you're claiming funding under the federal foster care funding title of the Social Security Act, you have to have a caseworker put their eyes on a child who's in care once a month. And there's no question that a program like the Adolescent Outreach Program is more costly than that, because those case managers see the young people 4 times a month, and they're able to spend more time with them, and they talk to them on the phone and do other things. So, but I'm not sure that the size of the population in Massachusetts, the foster care population, versus the size of the population in California really is all that relevant.
Okay, it looks like we have a second question for you, Dr. Courtney. What can you tell us about the next round of Chafee-funded evaluations, and will they focus on any subpopulations?
Right. So what the project is doing right now actually is looking for, at this point, really looking for programs that can be taken to the point where they can be evaluated. So at this point, we aren't actually identifying programs that we would immediately evaluate, which is what we were charged with doing the first time around. In particular areas of interest, for example, post-secondary education transitions and success in post-secondary education, we're looking at programs that have been in existence for a while and seeing what would the steps that would be necessary to ready them for rigorous random evaluation. And so that's kind of where we're at. We're doing that in a few different areas, and right now we haven't settled on any of those programs. And at this point, we're not focusing on any particular population, although it's possible that a program we would end up evaluating would be focused on a particular population. If you want to learn more about that program, you can go to your web browser and type in Chasing Next Generation Evaluation and go to the Administration of Children and Families Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation website, and it describes the project.
Okay, looks like we just got a question that came in. How do you think AB 403 will affect future research with transitional programs?
I'm not familiar with the details of that law. I assume that's a law in California. I'm not familiar with the details of it. So,
yeah, I think extended foster care in California was AB 12.
That was AB 12. AB 12, and I have heard. I mean, I just don't know enough about the details of AB 403 that I think I can comment, in a useful way on it.
Okay. Okay, doesn't look like we have any more questions. Oh. Yeah, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. So that's going to do it for us.
Yeah, just make sure to look out in your email for the email you'll be receiving directly after this webinar about the survey to help us out for future webinars. And then you'll also be receiving an email with this webinar and PowerPoint slides and all of the handouts when it's posted on the CEBC website. And it does look like we actually have one more question.
Yeah, so what role does cultural practices play in evidence-based practice?
That's a huge question. I mean, yeah. I think that you could apply that to really any kind of practice, and I think again, that would be a long conversation, but I think it's critically important that any practice we have attend to people's culture, and both in terms of how you're going to engage people, and who needs to be involved in an intervention. I mean, in some cultures, very difficult to involve particular individuals without involving other members of the family or community. So there's a lot that culture plays in the effectiveness of any particular practice. So I guess I would just say that's a great question, and it kind of depends on the group that you're trying to help and what the nature of the problem you're trying to address is, and what your techniques for change are.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so one last question before we end that came in, and I can answer this one, is if we are concerned that only including peer-reviewed publications will lead to a publication bias, many other review efforts in other areas do not include an eligibility criteria related to source. So I think that publication bias is a concern, yes. But in terms of why we rely on it, it's critical that we don't have the capacity to review things like statistical designs or things like power analysis or the appropriateness of certain methodological designs. We just don't have the capacity for that. We rate the research evidence as it is published, and so we rely on that peer-reviewed standard to be able to vet what's being put out there. And so there are journals out there that have very diverse publication standards and peer review processes, and so we're fully aware of that. And there's only so much that we can do about it. But if a paper comes in and there are concerns, We do have a scientific panel that we defer to that you can learn more about on our website if you go under expert panels. It's a team of people who are expert researchers within the field of child welfare who are very knowledgeable about publications and things like the peer review process. And so when we have issues when we rate programs, we defer to them, and there is a predetermined procedure for if there's any disputes with rating research. And so you can learn a lot more about that on our website. So I encourage you to check that out as well. But yes, that's an interesting question. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you for your time, Dr. Courtney, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a good day. Bye-bye.